Hi everyone, I'm Nora Akawi. I was very happy when Amina wrote to me with the news that this conference was underway and that we would have the opportunity to reconvene, this time in Doha, exactly 1 year after the first collaboration we had in New York, the conference titled Architecture and Representation, the Arab City, which I had co-organized with Dean Amal Andraus, together with Amina and the Qatar Foundation, the Middle East Institute at Columbia and the Columbia Global Centers in Amman. So I'm very happy to be here, to have the opportunity today to pick up on some of the ideas that were mentioned last year. Also to use this event as an opportunity to reflect on some of the core questioning that guide our work at Studio X Amman. I'm going to read very quickly because I made the decision to kind of merge two presentations into one, because I also wanted to set a scene. But it's a slightly different scene. I'll show some of the work we do later on, but very briefly, and in an attempt to crystallize our current modes of operation and our engagement in the context of a school of architecture, as they admittedly escape us at every turn, especially with the rapid, often devastating change that affect the environments that we work in, and that quickly destabilizes the seemingly settled planes of academic practice. In fact, it's been productive for us to understand Studio X precisely as part of the school of architecture that is most vulnerable facing the destabilizing forces of the world. And I'll explain what I mean by that later. But before, I wanted to turn to one of Edouard Said's texts about the university. And here I'm going to go a little bit abstract, but then linking back to education in kind of more concrete terms. In a lecture at the University of Cape Town in South Africa in 1991, titled Identity, Authority and Freedom, the Potentate and the Traveler, Edouard Said addresses the still very pressing question of academic freedom and the dangers of the relationship between the university and both political and economic powers and authority, and on the privileges but also the social and political responsibilities of civic institutions like the university. He concludes by suggesting that we see the university as a place to voyage in, to traverse territory, to abandon fixed positions. I will come back to this last point later, but I'd like to take a slightly longer detour through this text and highlight some of the concerns that he had then, but that are still as relevant and as urgent to us today as they were at the time of his lecture in '91. In the debate on academic freedom, on the one hand, we are faced with the argument that the university is to be exempt, purified even, of the everyday world. And on the other hand, there is the view that directly involves the university, the academic space of the university in that world, whereby the university is meant to be engaged intellectually and politically with significant political and social change, and to be responsive to abuse of power, which the university must not only be critical of, but also align itself in opposition to. So the myth of the university as an impermeable entity to the world outside, of course, no longer stands. Said reminds us that so much of the knowledge produced by Europe about Africa or about India and the Middle East originally derived from the need for imperial control. He continues, even geology and biology were implicated, along with geography and ethnography, in the imperial scramble of Africa. Said mentions both the concealed and the public instrumentalization of the American Academy by the government and military during the Vietnam War, where academics and researchers were working on topics like counterinsurgency or lethal research for the State Department, the CIA, or the Pentagon. To speak of a context I'm more familiar with, for these machines, the Caterpillar D9R, armored bulldozer, the Israeli Institute of Technology, known as the Technion in Haifa, has developed remote-controlled capabilities within the institution of the university. They were called the Black Thunder unmanned dozers, and according to an IDF officer, the newly improved machine performed remarkably during the Operation Cast Lead, the invasion of Gaza. Again, this idea of the university as separate from worldly concerns and politics has, of course, already been burst. More than that, both the academic space and the academic professionals working in that space continue to be targeted with the abuse of both political and economic power in order to silence narratives that challenge the profitable status quo. Edouard Said reminds us that also, at the time of his lecture in Cape Town, universities and schools in Palestine were closed entirely by the Israeli military authorities, who had actually kept the major universities closed in Palestine since the beginning of '88, so for longer than 3 years. Today they are still targeted, both from air and the ground. These are images from Al-Quds University's campus raided by Israeli forces on November 17th, so 2 weeks ago, where they fired rubber-coated steel bullets and tear gas canisters at students. Also today, in the case of the University of Illinois, Professor Stephen Salaita, who joined the American Indian Studies program with a tenured offer, was dehired on account of his statements on social media criticizing Israel's conduct of military operation in Gaza. The university is, of course, also a site of protest. As a response to the university being regarded increasingly as simply an arm of the government, and that it seemed to reflect only the interest of corporations and establishment power, Edouard Said gives an account of what he called a new worldliness in the university that denied it the relative aloofness that it once seemed to be entitled to. On the contrary, it called for the university to become the place where students would be educated as reformers. He continues, in quote, "Relevance was the new watchword." Another layer of challenges to the concept of academic freedom put forward in the text was in regards to the university's relationship to national identity in the post-colonial states of the Arab world, where universities were not only nationalist universities, but they were also political institutions. For Egypt or Algeria, national independence meant that at last, youth would be educated fully in the languages and cultures of their own, against colonial rule's efforts to establish a superiority of European learning. Like, for example, in Algeria, after the liberation in 1962, with the creation of a new governmental structure came an educational curriculum focused first on the teaching of Arabic and on Algerian history that were either banned or subordinated to programs stressing the superiority of French civilization. So when independence was achieved, and I quote Said, as a result of anti-colonial struggles, one of the first areas to be changed was education. Educational territory was then reclaimed and underwent a process of Arabization, so Arabization of the curriculum, Arabization of intellectual norms, etc. But what this also meant was that the national universities were conceived as extensions of the new national security state, with a mandate of shaping national identity. So while before Arab students' education was encroached upon by the colonial intervention of foreign ideas and norms, in the state building process, they were to be remade in the image of the rulers. This has had devastating consequences for the Arab university, according to Edouard Said. Academics were encouraged to conform rather than excel. And the general result was, and I quote, timidity, a studious lack of imagination, careful conservatism came to rule the intellectual practice. He writes that nationalism in the university has come to represent not freedom but accommodation, not brilliance and daring but caution and fear, not the advancement of knowledge but self-preservation. The only way to be free in the university was then to stay unnoticed, to be sure not to attract unwanted attention. Our generation sadly knows of this all too well still, and the case of Stephen Salaita in the University of Illinois and many others it shows that it's not restricted to academic institutions within any particular part of the world. But what this does highlight is the very basic fact that, as Said puts it, political repression, the lack of democratic rights, the absence of a free press, all of these things have never been good for academic freedom. They are in fact disastrous for academic and intellectual excellence. To make the practice of intellectual discourse dependent on conformity and to a predetermined political ideology or a predetermined canon of learning, for example, the Western canon or so on, is to nullify intellect altogether. So the question of academic freedom in relation to the state apparatus and national identity gets further layers of challenges when considering the interdependence of the globalized world. The interdependence economically, environmentally, and so on. But of course, no identity is homogeneous, no culture exists in isolation, so this interdependence is going to be reflected within academic institutions, within the university. But the question for Said is how? Do we substitute for a Eurocentric norm an Afrocentric or Arab-centric one? Or, as has happened so many times in the post-colonial world, do we return to models of education that are derived, I quote, lazily, adopted imitatively and uncritically from elsewhere? Academic freedom for Said is the freedom to be critical, the rejection of any kind of homely comfort. In a small parenthesis here, I also want to, in the context of this conference, thank Amina for the conference that, as it is placed within the context of the university, for inviting us not merely to celebrate the achievements of this fascinating mega project, but to critically reflect, as it is still in the works, on both the concerns and possibilities that this project brings forth. As a propositional quote, I want to read this out. The world we live in is made up of numerous identities interacting, sometimes harmoniously, sometimes antithetically. Not to deal with that whole is not to have academic freedom. We cannot make our claim as seekers after justice if we advocate knowledge only of and about ourselves. Our model for academic freedom should therefore be the migrant or the traveler. For if the real world outside the academy, we must be ourselves and only ourselves, then inside the academy we should be able to discover, travel among other selves, other identities, other varieties of human adventure. So he suggests that we consider academic freedom as an invitation to give up on identity in the hope of understanding or assuming more than one. We must always view the academy as a place to voyage in, owning none of it, but at home everywhere in it. According to Said, there are two ways for inhabiting academic and cultural space in the university. Either as the academic professional who is there in order to reign, so the king or the potentate, who is there to sit surveying everything with detachment and authority, defending particular borders, what should and should not be taught, what should or should not be included, defining disciplinary boundaries, reinforcing existing canons, etc. The other model that Said suggests is more mobile, more playful, although no less serious. The image of the traveler depends not on power, but on motion, on a willingness to go into different masks and rhetorics, and most of all, and most unlike the potentate who must guard only one place and defend its fronters, the traveler crosses over, traverses territories, and abandons fixed positions all the time. This is by no means a direct connection, but this is the Studio X Global Network that is put forth by Columbia University's School of Architecture, and that was set up by former Dean Mark Quigley, with the aim of turning the university inside out. This relates to the vulnerability that I mentioned earlier. We have locations in Beijing, Rio de Janeiro, Mumbai, Istanbul, Johannesburg, and Amman. In Amman, we work out of the Columbia Global Center in Amman and operate regionally with partners and collaborators in several Arab cities. Together with my colleague and co-curator Jawad Dakhkan, who is here with us, we work as a team of two, but together also with the Columbia Global Center staff in Amman, faculty at GSAP, collaborators from around Amman and the region. And the projects we work on vary from courses to workshops to public programs, library collections, publications, and so on. So this is a project that you will hear about later. We don't take Said's student as traveler proposal literally, but there is, in fact, a lot of traveling involved. Students at GSAP often go through their 3 years of MARC with at least a couple of summer workshops and a couple of traveling studios and traveling seminars. The last big conference we had was the one I mentioned earlier, Architecture and Representation, for which Qatar Foundation was a partner. It was a gathering of architects, urbanists, historians, theorists, anthropologists, and other teachers and practitioners working on or in the Arab world. The videos are all online and are accessible. A project that I will dwell on a little more at length is titled Echoing Borders. It began as a workshop that Nina Kolovratnik and I organized and taught together with colleagues including George Katodritis, who you'll hear from also, in the summer of 2014 in Amman and Istanbul. And since the project grew into a series of seminar courses, so far two at GSAP in New York. With the seminar last year, we traveled to Jordan, and this year we traveled to Jordan and Lesvos, Greece, until around 10 days ago. What the project focuses on so with the overwhelming density and rate of forced migration in the world, we see that borders are multiplying and they're dissolving, shifting and transforming, which challenges conventional static forms of representation of boundaries in the state apparatus. The seminar takes as a starting point our problematic understanding of the world and of territoriality as it is still rooted in our imagination, that space is divided into compartmentalized, distinct, and mutually exclusive formations. In the seminar, which is focused on both theoretical readings and drawing and mapping projects, we address issues of mobility, fluidity, and geopolitical transformation, with particular focus on the place of the refugee in contemporary politics. We focus on the tension between the density of migration across borders, both formal and informal on the one hand, and the very static definitions of and access to citizenship and human rights on the other. Our challenge is to visualize migration and movement across borders as the central elements that define contemporary territories and geopolitical terrains. In order to read and represent borders, I went too far. In order to read and represent borders that are in formation and in constant flux, we must stop and represent each of these moments in their materiality in space. Through this visualization process, what we hope is that we begin to challenge the dangerously static perceptions of representations of such spaces. We hope that through a focus on representing dynamic processes rather than conditions or situations, we leave within these gaps some room for imagining alternative outcomes and alternative readings of the territories in question. We have a very large group of collaborators. This is that has been growing since we started. I will just briefly show you a couple of projects that were developed by 3 students that took the class. This is the no man's land on the border between Jordan and Syria. It is located here in this zone. There is a stretch that is kind of like a buffer zone. This project looks at the movement that happened within that no man's land by refugees fleeing into Jordan from Syria, and what started to form as what you see here as an informal settlement in the waiting time that they needed to spend in order to enter through the Jordanian border. And then also here, so we start to see the formalization of what used to be just a trench of sand into an actual border crossing. This other project by Juan Pablo Azares, also from last year, shows the formal and informal flows of people and goods, both in and out of Zaatari refugee camp in Jordan, analyzing the various types of separation, security mechanisms, surveillance surrounding the camp. Another project that attempts to kind of reread the border regions through their fluctuating reality is a reading of the smuggling networks and the process of going through from Syria into Turkey and onwards for a Syrian refugee through the smuggling network. And here there are several moments of these border locations and what types of interactions and what types of transactions happen. He worked very closely with an anthropologist called Luigi Achilli, who had been doing research on this. This is a project that's still in progress. So, very briefly, another program that happened in March last year and that's continuing is titled Propositions on Threat and Yaqeen. Is a recurring spring symposium that brings together architects, artists working on areas in conflict. The questions that we raised there are on the role of research-based practices in architecture and on pedagogical projects within these zones. The next iteration, which will take place in March again, will focus on the notion of reconstruction, but we won't focus only on the physical reconstruction of destroyed cities, for instance, but also on the reconstruction of lost archives, the reconstruction of imaginaries or of our disrupted narratives. Janet Abou-Lughud's library, her private collection, late Janet Abou-Lughud's private collection was donated to Studio X Amman and the Columbia Global Centers. And now we are working with Cluster, a group from Cairo, on putting all of the content online, making it searchable for anyone interested. And the last project I'll mention is a project led by Jawad Tukhkan and upcoming workshop that Jawad and Antonio Ottomanelli, our architect and photographer, are holding in Amman from December 8th to 14th. Looking at, titled Frozen Imaginaries, and looking at the unfinished large-scale projects that are in the city of Amman, documenting them through photographic documentation and mappings, but also finding their place or thinking about their place in relation to the region's recent political history and unsettlement, and better understanding the reasons for the failure of these projects, and perhaps even imagining alternative futures for these sites. Applications are open, and yeah, you can get in touch. There are no fees, or anyone interested, you're very welcome. Thank you.